He studied business informatics and art history, media theory, painting and philosophy in various universities in Germany and United Kingdom. He has been a visiting scholar at numerous universities, such as Columbia University. He's the editor of the young and already well-known international journal for digital art history, and he recently edited Art Theory as Visual Epistemology. He's the author of a book about the self-portrait of Dürer in 2004, and of another book published in 2011, Amerikanische Historienmalerei, Neue Bilder für die neue Welt. He has been a speaker in a great number of international conferences, and today he will speak about similarity, difference, and gaps in the visual arts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much for the invitation to this great international conference, and I think as usual I will be learning most from this conference, more than I can tell you. I have to say at first, I'm here as an art historian. I have, as she said, also been in information science, but I'm here as an art historian. And as a German art historian, as a matter of fact, that you will find out in the examples I show you, but also as a digital art historian. And a digital art historian means art history is trying to find out how we can use computers to better do our job. How can we do better art history with the use of computers? So what I will show you here are a few questions I have towards the information science, and I hope it doesn't come like criticism. It's rather how we can develop systems for art history together, because I believe the solution for everything that maybe sound like criticism here can be solved in an interdisciplinary endeavor. So if we want to make information science useful for art history, we should look at the question, what does art history want? And following Lev, I should have titled my talk, what does art history want? Maybe this is better, a better phrase. Yes, maybe. So there are many projects that use image similarity in order to create what we call meta images or big image data, in order to show the user, the art historian, something what he maybe not have seen before. For example, we have many image collections, like photo collections, art collections, and so on, that exists on databases. But the question is, how can we access it? How can we come from the data we have there to a certain knowledge? How can we support the art historian in finding what he wants to find? And if we look at image similarity projects, there have been a few in the past. I hope I have mentioned the most important ones. John Resig made something, a prototype for the Pharos project, for the Pharos consortium. That's a photo collection consortium that uses the TinEye service, for example. Carl Stamer from UC Davis created something that's called Archive Vision, where he's using OpenCV, and he continues to develop that with Getty money in the future. There is, of course, the replica project by Benoit, who will tell us more about this later on. And I have learned about a few other projects like of Peter Bell and Björn Ommer, who are developing or want to develop something as part of the focus program on digital image that is funded through funding from the German Research Foundation. Ralf Ewert from the University of Hanover, for example, has a project that's called iArt, who wants to go in that direction, and many more. So you probably know more examples. and I will look at a few things I, as an art historian, find interesting in such systems. The most famous of that system is, of course, the Art and Culture Project, and they are using TSNE map, and you probably know what that is. No art historian knows. But for an art historian, that's maybe not important. The art historian doesn't know what a TSNE map is and doesn't know anything about mapping of a multidimensional space to a three-dimensional space. What the art historian sees here is probably that there is a kind of landscape, a kind of topography that maybe has a certain beauty in itself, and that is interactive and allows the user to somehow fly into that landscape in order to find certain similarities. And if we do that, we find something like this, and we actually see certain similarities, but the question the art historian would ask here is, what are the similarities, for example, between that image and that image? Why are they in spatial proximity to each other? What actually, if you look at it again, what does the topography actually tell us? What does it represent? We have a certain height here, and that height obviously means something, but the user doesn't know what it means.
Just want to mention, there is one other project which you actually didn't put in your list, which is from Yale Digital Humanities Lab. You know, the photo where we made similarity map of the thousands of photos.
Okay.
Which is, sorry.
I put this in my list.
Okay, yeah. sorry.
We can look at that again.
Yeah.
But there seems to be three axes, it's three-dimensional, and for the user it's not clear, not really transparent what kind of similarities are visualized here. And from an art historical point of view, the problem here is also the art historian usually wants to tell stories of art. And that means you have a certain starting point from which you go from one point to the other and have a certain narration that you can tell. So how do we start here? We have no keyword slot where you can search for something by keyword, for example, and we have no starting point from which we can go to other points. The best of such systems I found so far is that of Benoit. If I show a screenshot, I hope I don't tell too much of what you will tell about later. Here we have such a slot on the top of the screen where we can search for something, and it searches through the metadata most probably in order to find some images. And now we get, again, a certain similarity. We can find images on the two-dimensional space that have crucifixion, in that example, in their metadata. And the interesting thing is that the system allows us to include certain images and exclude other images in order to walk a certain path through that image database. For example, we take the crucifixion on the bottom right here by Matthias Grünewald. We can take this into our search algorithm, and now it shows us only visual similarities, so no metadata anymore, as far as I know. And we get a lot of crucifixions, more lighter images on the left, darker images on the right. And we have a lot of crucifixions here and a lot of kind of similar images. But now our starting point is somehow lost. And the question is, where do we start and where does it appear in that image? And it seems they are statistically somehow similar, but the question is, how meaningful is that to an art historical researcher? What do we do with that bunch of crucifixions now? Where's the story we want to tell? Some very different looking images might be, so similar looking images might be not very relevant to the art historians, but some different looking ones are maybe more relevant. So what we do here is a kind of comparison. And comparison, what comes first to our mind if we say we compare artworks, is Heinrich Wölfflin in the early 20th century mostly because he introduced a new medium to art historical research, that is the slide. And for about 50 to 75 years, we organized big slide libraries in our departments of art history, and we took images from this library, and Heinrich Wölflin projected them side by side in order to compare them. So we should do the same. We dim the lights and we turn on the left slide projector and we turn on the right slide projector and see two images that we have taken from our slide library in the early 20th century in Munich, by the way. And what we see here are two images that appear very similar to each other. As a matter of fact, we have the mayor of Basel, whose name is Jakob Meyer here, his first and deceased wife and his second wife, his daughter. We don't know who that is and why this person is here. They are standing or kneeling on a carpet with a certain fold here. In the background we see a Madonna with a child and a crown in front of a certain kind of architecture with a shell-like structure that indicates probably the hortus conclusus in which she is and in which also the donor of this image is. So on the right side we see everything I just brought into words as well. But the interesting thing is we could also switch the sides and look at what similarity do we have here and what differences do we have here. And if you look at the differences, and Lev already said that may be more interesting, what is different between those two images is, for example, the figures appear much larger, take more space in the foreground. Maybe there's less depth here, more depth there. Maybe we can say something about color, I'm not sure. And maybe you know that these are not just two examples I've taken out of my mind. These are two examples that were at the center of the so-called Dresden-Holbein dispute in 1871, where art historians disputed about which one is the original and which one is the copy. So by looking at the originals, by the way, at 1871, they were discussing about what was pleasing more to the eye of those contemporaries, what had a certain feeling that was more Holbein-like on the one hand, and on the other hand, there were those people who were looking just at formal features and compared those two objects in their similarities and differences. And in the end, this comparison should lead to something which is an art historical result. That is dating, that is when was it done, that is attribution, that is who made it, and a temporal or chronological order, that is which is earlier, which is later. And in this case, the left one is the Madonna from Darmstadt, the other one is from Dresden, and by this comparison they found the left one is the original Holbein, and the right one is a copy from the 17th century, what the formal art historians found out, and later on it was approved by physical analysis, for example. But the importance here is, by comparing them, we bring them into a chronological order. That means that an image A might be similar to an image B, but does that mean that an image B is also similar to an image A? I think the similarity is not necessarily the same in both directions. And if it's not the same, it can give us certain clues on the chronology of those images. So we should look in both directions. So that is kind of old traditional art history. I want to show you something more digital. This is a project we have been running in Munich for several years now, I think 6 years, where we try to generate data by gamification. That is, we have an image database and we show the user an image and we ask the user to enter what he sees in this box here, so by tagging. The user gets some gaming points, gets in a high score list, plays against a virtual opponent, and it's a lot of fun. You can try that on artigo.org. What we gather in the back end are tags. So every image has a kind of a word cloud, or if you like, a bag of words that surrounds that image. So all in all, we gather many million tags to many thousand images. We have made that data set open access, by the way. You can find this on our websites. In 3 languages, by the way. These are the English ones, a part of the English ones. So if we now compare 2 objects, for example, by Albrecht Dürer, you could look at them, but you could also look at the tags they have. So these are the tags that both images have. For example, one of them has a hat on the right side. The other one has, they're both men, they're both faces. So these are the similarities. But on the left side, the person has no hat. On the right side, it has a hat. On the left side, there's an ear visible. On the right side, there's no ear visible. And that is reflected in the tags we have. So actually, these are the areas where they share certain tags, and this is the similarity. Well, these are the tags that only the left one has, and those tags are the ones that only the right one has. And according to Lev, we should not focus so much on the middle ground, but on the differences we find here. So comparison means we should look into both directions. It's about similarities and differences, and comparison is not about appearance only, that is visual similarity, but also about its content, and in the end about its meaning. So 2 images could be similar even if they look differently, because they are similar maybe in content. I'll show you an example later. The goals of art history in comparison is, as I said, dating attribution, and then the contextualization of objects in the history of art, and in the end we want to give meaning to the world by looking at the cultural history of our culture, so to speak. So the first would be a visual similarity. If you don't mind, Benoit, I look at replica once again. Now I've started with I'm looking for the brothers, the Horatii brothers, because I'm interested, for example, in the painting by Jacques-Louis David. And if I enter Horatii here, I actually get that image that I'm looking for, and also get a detail of it. And to my wonderful surprise, I also get a preliminary drawing here, because they all have something in the metadata that has Horatii, including Horatio McMulloch, who painted Loch Awe, obviously. So this is something that might be interesting, but probably in this case I'm not. If I bring this into a 2-dimensional space, we also find it here. We see some proximity. We see the other objects further away. And what we can do now is really great. We can mark that and tell it that we want to show more of what is similar to that painting, and then it should show us only which is visually similar to that. So not the metadata, only visual similarity. And what you now find is something that was not shown to us before, because it has no metadata with the Horatii, but it's also a preliminary drawing to the original painting that we see here. And we also get other images that have some people in there that have a similar a gesture maybe that might be worth looking at. If we look at this visual similarity, we also find what has now disappeared, because we are not looking at the metadata anymore. That detail is gone from our view, and that preliminary drawing is also gone. So it means looking at the metadata and similarity there makes sense. Only visual similarity also makes sense, but maybe we should distinguish between those levels, and it depends on what the art historian is interested in. Is he interested in something that contains that word in the title, or have similar gestures, or in any other art historical question we could pose? There's not only one. And the interesting thing, I do some promotion for your system, is that we can also compare those two images and overlap them. If you try that, This is a public demo. Is it okay that I show those images? In that case, it shows us that detail in the larger painting. If we go from the detail to the painting, but as I said, A to B is not B to A. If we do it the other way around, it doesn't work, of course, because the larger painting is not really in the smaller painting. So, visual similarity, where does it help? For example, finding duplicates, because visual similarity very much shows us if there's 99% similarity, this is most probably a duplicate. We can find works of art before and after conservation, which is interesting. If it's not in the metadata, if we don't find it across different domains, across different databases, this would be an element, a method that helps us to find that. Copies of the same artwork, probably crop detail shots of the same artwork as we have seen, and certain cataloging errors become apparent quite easily. But as I said, similarity is only one way visual similarity is only one way of showing similarity. There's also similarity in content. So what does that mean? Content, we come to another German art historian, is Panofsky. And Panofsky showed us different levels of meaning. The first level of meaning is the pre-iconographic description. That is, we describe what we see. For example, a man with a beard and a dagger. That is what we directly see without any further interpretation. The second level of meaning is what he calls an iconographic analysis. That is, a man with a beard and a dagger is most probably a certain holy person. And the third meaning of interpretation is the iconological interpretation. That means, what does that particular holy person mean in a larger cultural context of Western Europe, for example, including Christianity and so on. So if we look at such a painting on those levels that build upon each other, we have to do that in one image and the other image, and then compare on those levels of meanings, I believe. So how could that work in practice? I show you another system that we've built in Munich, and you also can try this out following this URL. We've taken this Artigo data in a system, and you can interactively look through that data for similarities. And the first thing you find, if you sort it by most exact similarities of those tags, and those tags represent content, you find duplicates, of course. Because images that are the same, two prints of the same wood block, have the same content, they look the same, and they have the same content. That means they share most of the tags that we have generated. But if you go down that list, it becomes more interesting to an art historian. For example, here we have only the content. They look very different, but the content is the same. That's the birth of Christ, but in a different medium, by different artists, but in different time periods. And now it's getting interesting for someone who is interested in the content of artworks. That is kind of the second Panofsky level. We have brought the Artigo tags also into a three-dimensional visualization. I'm not sure if this is already great, but what you can see here is not only visual similarity, it's a bit old already, 2015. But
that's even better that it was able so early.
But what if you start here at a certain image, you can find other images in close proximity that are similar in content. And what you see on the left, for example, are landscapes. You see on the right portraits, which are in color on the top and in black and white on the bottom, for example. You have some architectural work, and I think in the lower end are the abstract works that share certain tags that others don't have. So what I am interested in an art as an art historian in such a system is that we build something that I can use that is supporting my questions, answering my questions. So similarity plays a role in a research environment. That means The computer should show us similarity and differences. It should create a certain transparency. That means it should be clear what similarity model is being used and what relations spatial proximity actually represent. And it should allow to choose between different similarity models according to my research interests, so that I'm each interested in certain levels of meaning, so to speak. So the third one is then similarity in meaning. I show a few examples. Most of them are inspired by Werner Busch, a famous German art historian. And he showed us a few weeks ago this painting by Joseph Wright of Derby. You all know that that's the experiment with an air pump, and there is a bird, a cockatoo, in a glass bulb, and they suck out the air, and it seems like the bird is dying, and with his left hand on the top he can open the valve and let air in again, and the bird comes to life again. Which is not only a scientific experiment, but it's also a symbol, an allegory for life and death. That's what our historians believe actually. If you look at the earlier version of that, it's no cockatoo, but a common songbird here. So we could say there's a certain similarity in birds, a more general concept. But what art historians see in here is not just any bird that is in a glass chamber. What we think of is maybe that kind of bird. And that kind of bird is actually no bird. It is the Holy Ghost. It's a symbol for a bird. And if you then continue that path to that glass bowl with a bird inside, that's something very special to the Bavarian forest. It's a glass bowl in which you have the Holy Ghost that's usually hanging from the ceiling on top of the table, and if you put the soup on the table, the evaporation gathers at that glass bowl and drops back into the soup. So that's why it's called Suppenbrunzer, that is, it's peeing into the soup again. But it has been quite common in the Bavarian area in the 19th century. And these are connections that might be interesting, because even if in meaning it's totally different, it is maybe visually quite similar, while we have some a link between those two is that symbol of the Holy Ghost, just as an example. Another example that Werner Busch made is that engraving by William Hogarth. What we see here on the left, this is a scene with a lot of people that we can talk for a long time. But what we have here is obviously a drunken person who has fallen to the ground, but is lying there, and a woman comes and tries to pick him up, and this is a ridiculous scene. But it's not only ridiculous as a scene, it's more ridiculous if you know what similarity is there. There's a certain joke, there's a certain wit in that image, because it reflects, it takes the form of the descent from the cross, where Jesus is placed in a similar position, and Hogarth takes that visual formula and brings it into a visual joke. And a visual joke is something the computer will probably never understand. This is something what his contemporaries understood, and they were laughing at this kind of cartoon. So what I think we need to look at are different layers of meaning that we need to compare in order to create networks of meaning that we can then follow as paths. So what we should rather speak of is not similarity, but something I call interpictoriality. You know probably intertextuality, and we need something like interpictoriality. It already exists, not my invention. But it means that we need to find relations on different levels. These relations are the things that art historians are interested in. Art historians are actually not so much interested in the individual artwork, but always in a connection to other artworks. What we need to look at are certain visual allusions, quotations, calques, plagiarism, translations, pastiche, and parodies, because these are the things that are interesting in the comparison of such images. And for that, now I'm talking in information science terms again, for that we probably need more than images and metadata. We need what we call multimodal data. That is, we need to include unstructured text, for example, or any kind of structured data that represent another level of meaning. In our art history department, you don't see the slide library anymore because we have image databases, but we still have 3 levels of a library, because we are still consulting books, because in that books is the actual knowledge that we generated from looking at images. So text is still very important. Last example that is also taken, that Panofsky, by the way, showed in a certain text is this one. Here, in the middle, we see a baby. We all know what baby that is. On the top right, we see another baby. And in visual similarities, these are 2 babies, and that would be connected as babies. But as members of the Western civilization, we know there's no flying baby in the sky. Because that baby on the right is a different kind of baby. It's a vision of a baby. It's a baby that appeared in front of those viewers. So those babies are not very similar to each other. This baby on the top right is more similar to the angels in that part of the image. So it means there are also certain historical changing of meaning in images, and we as humans, we understand those different meanings. We see such kind of a painting and instantly we know there's no flying baby. This means something else, and it's very hard for the computer to have that cultural understanding. But the computer maybe doesn't need to have that cultural understanding. The semantic gap that is there can be filled by the human. We have that cultural understanding. But the question is, how does the computer and the human researcher work together in an interactive way that each of those participants, the computer and the researcher, can make the best contribution it can make. The computer having control over billions of images if necessary, and the human having those cultural understanding of images. And only then we come to a certain similarity that Abby Warburg showed us, that it's not mere visual similarity where we take certain features from the image data, but similarities and proximity that he brought on visualized on those black cardboards that are on several levels, and we have not found out in every case what level Warburg was looking on in every case. So the last point I want to make is how do we get from one point to the other? Usually we say we want to come from data to knowledge. That's the whole purpose of it. So let's take at data and what art historians think about data. Johanna Drucker said, data as a Latin word means the given. But Johanna Drucker says data is not given, it is taken. We actually should not say data, we should call it capta, because in the way we create data, in the way we acquire data, we already make sense of the world. We already have an idea of what we are looking at, and then we take that features and structure it in a certain way. So this is already the first level of interpretation of the world, so to speak. So the data, according to her, represents an observer's point of view. It's not truth that we want to make into a kind of knowledge. And something similar applies to science. Science is not about the given, I believe. Science is actually, in its goal, it's about hypothesis about the world. It's about creating a new understanding of the world. Similarity in a research environment eventually should show what else is similar here, but also what is not there. What are the blank spots? I'm mostly interested in those things that are not in the database, that where I can make up my mind and fill that gap. So the computer should show me the gaps worth filling, and for the last time the replica. It's interesting what we have here on the left, and it makes a certain sense that are certain groups of figures, But what I wonder is what happens on the right side. What actually is the connection between this image and that image? And what I'm mostly interested in is the black spot here. The computer should not only show me what we have, what similarities we have, what we can compute, but the computer should also show me where it's interesting to look at, where there's nothing yet, what I, as a user of the system, can fill with meaning. So art history, I believe, is not so much about science in the exact sense, it's about sense making. We are creating meaning as art historians. Art history, I believe, is about storytelling. We're telling the story of art. In German, Kunstgeschichte means also die Geschichte der Kunst. That means the history or the story of art. So that means, in other words, we lay paths through certain networks. And I expect from the computer that it shows me the next possible or relevant node in that network. That means I have certain things in mind, certain comparisons of images, but I want the computer to show me the next one that might be interesting. So I imagine the computer as a companion. So far we have only used, as far as I see, similarity, that means visual similarity. But through interaction with the machine and through personalization of the outcome, that means the computer understands that I am me and not someone else, understands what I'm interested in, we can customize the results. And as I said, the semantic gap can then be filled by the human through interaction. So in the end, what is the goal of the whole endeavor? Is not that the computer should do our job in the end. I'm teaching students and I'm teaching them art history not by saying that in 20 years the computer will do your job. I teach them to use the computer to do their job better in the future. So the computer should be a companion for us to do better art history. And artificial intelligence in the end, I imagine as a companion in the sense of a knowledge navigator that you might remember as promotional or a video that Apple once did, where you have a machine and you can talk to that machine. The machine is a companion to you and what you want to do. So what I would like to do, last slide, this is, I think, is let's say we start with this image. What comparable images are we looking for? Well, as I said, on many levels of meaning. One image could be this one, because it's similar in visual. There's a man lying there and people looking at this. There's a certain similarity because it's the same metadata, there's the same artist, for example. But we could also bring that image into view because there are also people sitting around the table but looking at something that is outside of the view of the observer, of us. A similar situation in your room is that one from Kennedy, I think, that we could then take as next node. We could also bring another image of that series from the Obama photographer into view here. Then we could take as a next node a similar situation room in the era of Ronald Reagan, where they're looking at a battlefield from afar, just like Napoleon was looking at a battlefield from afar. So we come from one point to the other through several nodes, and the computer should tell me the next one that I don't know yet, the next one that I haven't seen yet because the capacity of my mind is limited, but the capacity of the computer is virtually unlimited. So how can I struggle together with the computer to tell better stories of art? So my conclusion is we should look at comparisons again, that they don't work in both directions usually. We should be interested in differences as well. For example, for an art historian, this always has to do with a timeline. If we look at it as a user interface, the question is, what does space represent? And I believe we need to have a certain grammar, a visual grammar of such systems. And form alone, like Wölflin, doesn't help much. If it's alone, we should better think of levels of meaning that is closer to Panofsky, or better networks of relations on many of those meaning levels, that is more Warburg. And if we look at the research environment, I think genealogy of form is only one of many elements by how we navigate through visual content. And we have to think about not only about similarity, but relevance. What is relevant to the art historical user, and the role of the user as a companion in the endeavor to create meaning. And that is everything an art historian wants, and digital art historians in that sense wants. And as I said in the beginning, this is something we don't demand, but where we make the offer to collaborate on, that we come to the point that the computer really helps us in the humanities to do a better job in giving meaning to the world, because that's our main job. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Harald, for this talk about something we didn't focus about blank spots, gaps, and the two directions of similarity that is very, very important. So I'd like to open the discussion period. Ralph?
Yes, thank you both of you for your wonderful papers. Actually, I have a question of an art historian, because I'm also an art historian. And I'm working in the field of what I call relational iconography. So I'm interested not exactly in visual similarities or content similarities, but the spatial connection or the spatial proximity between different types of objects in a specific context. So, as you know, for the Middle Ages and for the early modern period, many works of art were situated in a specific spatial context. And so they are related to other images, which are not comparable at the level of iconography or even formal aspect, but because they are situated in the same space. And so I don't know how to transfer this, what can I call that, this expectation within computational sciences or information sciences. How can I create this web of images related to a specific, because I have the impression that this aspect isolate images and connect them within an abstract space. So the real space of their exhibition interests me a lot. So how can I address this issue?
With the founding of the major museums in France and Germany and elsewhere, objects were dislocated from, let's say, churches, altarpieces into the museums, into that white cube. So that even also means they were disconnected in their spatial proximity they had before. And the spatial proximity they had before made certain sense, because if you went through a church, you saw a certain series of paintings or sculptures or murals when you were walking through the, the niches, for example. And if you take them, decontextualize them and bring them into museum space, they either get lost or you have to reconstruct them, at least in a virtual environment or in your mind. You know, so art history, in my, you can tell me if you share that idea of art history, also always means that we try to reconstruct contexts that are no more there today, but that we can reconstruct in a digital space, for example. So if we're talking about a web of knowledge that has that network and nodes and so on that connect with each other, that is not static. That is not that information scientists help us to somehow grab truth and bring it into a knowledge graph. But that knowledge graph always needs to have a chronological development. That means we can, like in a time machine, we can go back in time and look at the context and the web of knowledge at the time of creation, for example, or at any other point in time. That's more complex, but that's actually what we art historians in our brain do, but only with a certain limited capacity.
So it's possible to do this with with your tool or what's the name? So your lab. You mean it's possible to connect the object coming from the same context? Is it possible to do it right now? Interconnect the objects or the pictures coming from the same context, the same church. Is it possible to do this?
In a system that we've built?
In your system?
No.
No. Okay. That was my question. That was my question.
And that assumes that already organized information in your original information system. I'm not sure there is any system that has that level of granularity.
Okay.
So
that would be great.
But it could be possible to have metadata describing the exact localization for a given time
That's
period.
a matter of data acquisition,
yes.
and also, by the way, a matter of data infrastructure that we should build on a European level, where we can bring all those data together. And that's why we should think about how such a data infrastructure should look like, that we have that possibilities that I think are not there yet.
My question were about the first level of Panofsky, because you show that it's a retrieval, it's the end of the answer, and in fact I think it's the beginning of the answer.
The lowest
Because
level is the beginning.
From third to return to second floor or
You would
first
go
floor, I think.
Top
with-
down.
with
You would
the-
go
the
bottom
answer
top,
of the
top
third.
down.
Because in between a drunkard or a pieta, I think metadata can answer to this. But the simple view of the two doesn't. It's not enough.
Right, I agree. By the way, Panofsky had 3 levels, and the lowest is always called the first level. I usually add a 0th level to it, because that's what we call the low-level features like brightness, color, and so on. And this is what Panofsky doesn't talk about, but we can also use them and then step up that ladder. It's right, and there are certain metadata that we have that we can create from visual data and then come to a higher semantic level.
Sorry.
No, you. Okay. So, two questions, and maybe don't have to answer because we don't have time. So one question is more technical. So we absolutely agree that one of the problems with current, let's say, stage with maps of similarity differences is that we use many features, or traditional features. We use, let's say, features generated in the last layer of the neural network, right? And when we give you similarity map, but you don't understand that why can't be the things these two things are similar, right? And you said we need to have we need to be able to tell computer, show me similarity by this, or why do you generate this model. But I think it's kind of impossible in data science today, because once you use multiple features, whenever you do ECA, MDS, TSNE, neural network features, right? Each dimension combines, right, many different features. So in general, the human brain can't really understand, right? Because let's say each axis can combine, different percentages of 20, 100, 1,000 different features. And that's why in my lab we did lots of visualizations using only 2 features, because we were able to understand. So I'm curious how you think this can be solved. The second issue is
Answer is I don't know.
no.
I don't know.
Okay, yeah. So, but basically, it's our goal for future. Yeah. So maybe digital art history can give challenge to data science. Why not?
Yes.
Right? And the second question is more larger. So I admire your work. I love your work. Every presentation is like a jewel. But I can always have the same question. I think your knowledge of art history, right? It's like a bit how art history was formulated by, let's say, by 1930s. I would say especially Panofsky model, and basically 100 years in right from that moment, and I'm not saying that Panofsky model is wrong. I think it's probably still the best overall model. But then I wonder, right, what else our history can do, especially since we have these computational tools. Because the feeling sometimes I get from your work is like, okay, and that maybe also applies maybe a bit to your project, right, with forms. Okay, so somebody developed some ideas in 1950s, 1930s, intuitively, we're like thinking about the tools we have now, we have these tools, now we can do it. But maybe we can also do something very different, I don't know what, right? I mean, you can also think what our historians have been doing in the last few decades, very challenging the canon, very challenging history of our history, right? They are making exhibitions which are not based in periods, but based in fact in visual connections. So I just wonder about it, Yeah. I mean, or maybe I misunderstand what you're doing, It's like because the way I see it is like let's have computers to finally realize what people were imagining in the early 30s. And that's good, but maybe we can imagine something else. Or maybe these people were like not thinking correctly, And I was why not use computers to question Panofsky, for example. You kind of think you would tell students to do in your essay. But again, maybe I misunderstand your project.
I try to rephrase your question in the way, at what point of the development of digital art history are we now? The first step has been the digitization of our media. That is, we don't use the slide library anymore. We have the slide library digitized as an image database. That has been the first step. I think we have accomplished this already 20 years ago. The second step is digital, maybe what can really be called digital art history. That is, we acknowledge the fact that our media, our data is in a digital form. That means we can process and compute it, and we can do something with it that we couldn't do before because we couldn't compute thousands and millions of images before in a slide library. But the third stage that is only starting right now and where we don't really know where it's heading to